Okay, so just to start off, we were wondering, first off, if you could talk a little bit about your time at Poly and maybe how that influenced your writing career as you started writing and then kind of started writing books specifically.
Well, in literally, I learned to read and write at Poly, and as I said this morning, I learned to read and write in the more important ways at Poly, which is to think critically, to write, to think with empathy, to ask questions, to talk about books. Really, the language that I use even today in talking about books, writers, voices, stories. I first learned at Poly in classrooms in those in the English department right over there, of just how to discuss what a book is and what's in it. And so all that started here. And the same is true with writing. And I started writing short stories when I was at Poly, poetry, which was really bad. And I began to sort of figure out how to express myself through language here. And when I was at Poly, there was a literary magazine called Polygraph, which I think has been defunct for a long time, but it was the literary magazine, and I was co-editor, like you guys, of that, and it was there that I would read stories. So students would submit stories and poetry. I'd read those, discuss them, edit them, select them, and I didn't know it at the time, but that was my first job as an editor. And I went on to become an editor at Random House, and there were a lot of similarities in what I was doing, which is reading something closely, trying to understand what the author was trying to say, why it resonated with me or not, and how to help a writer reach his or her vision. And I did that here at Polygraph, and I was doing that at Random House. So that had a huge impact on me as well.
Could you talk about your earlier influences, and maybe specifically at your time or during your time at Poly?
You mean like teachers?
No, just like
writers.
Yeah, writers.
Writer. Okay. Yeah. So when I was, as I told this little story this morning, I went to the library, to the Pasadena Public Library, and looked for queer voices. And I just devoured my way through that library, trying to read every queer story I could find, to try to find a version of myself, and to try to see something that I wasn't yet seeing, to see something in the world that I couldn't find at the time. And so I read Truman Capote, Tennessee Williams, James Baldwin, Edmund White, Armistead Maupin. Those were some of the major writers that were important to me, telling different gay stories and showing different queer characters, and what it showed me was it didn't show me, but it told me that there was no one way to be queer, that the version of myself I got to define, and that's a very empowering thing to learn as a young person, that you get to define who you want to be, and there are people before you who have done that, and in the act of doing it opens up a lot for you, and so those writers and that experience of reading very deeply of writers who came before me, just gave me a lot of in terms of thinking of what I wanted to do.
Okay.
I was curious in terms of the role that reading had early on. Where do you think, as you look towards the future of literature, or I know that you recently established a scholarship for emerging trans writers.
Yeah. I'm
wondering, what do you think is kind of the future for diversifying literature, and how do you think publishing companies and I guess the literary establishment can help do that?
In some ways, I think it's no different than what has always gone on when publishing is at its best, and when editors are doing their best jobs, and what I tried to do, which is listen and read and pay attention to new voices, new stories. And one of the things, when I was an editor at Random House, I would get emails every day from all over. People, agents that I knew, literary agents that I knew, but also writers, friends of some friend of friend of friend of friend. And what I knew, one of my jobs was to be open, because you don't know where that new voice is going to come from. You don't know who has something special to say until you read it. And even though the volume could be very high, I knew my job was to like keep my eyes and ears open, because it seemed to me that it was quite likely that a very unique voice was going to come from an unexpected place. And what I would also try to do is think of myself as, I felt like one of my jobs as a book editor at a big publishing house was to kind of represent the reader. And by this I mean, as a reader, I want to read something I haven't read before. I want to hear voices I haven't heard before. I want doors to be open that weren't open. And so, and I feel like there are other readers out there like that. And so I felt like I was representing them. And so when I would encounter something that I hadn't read before, I would really try to understand it and then make a case for like why a big publishing house like Random House should publish it, and why the newness was actually a really important quality to it. I see over here, this is this is a book I edited, Open City by Teju Cole, which is it's just a great book. And Teju is, he's American. He was born in Michigan to Nigerian parents, and then when he was 2 months old, they took him back to Nigeria, and he grew up in Nigeria. And it's a story of a half Nigerian doctor in New York, and different people he meets and what they represent to him about his own past and to America's past. And it's a very philosophical novel, and it doesn't have like a standard plot, but it's when the manuscript came to me from his literary agent, it's a very hard book to describe in terms of like what is it about. It's one of those books where you just kind of have to read it. And so when I read it, I thought, this story it's not a traditional story, but I knew I had never encountered a mind like this, that this author's mind was very unique, and I wanted to play a role in bringing his voice to a larger audience. So that's an example of what I would do, and I think that's what publishers still can do.
So as a writer, when you're trying to tell these stories that haven't really been told before, such as with the Danish Girl, where do you or how do you find the inspiration for those stories?
I read. I keep my ears and eyes open. I think that you guys are writers, and tell me if this sounds like something you experience. Sometimes I get very busy in life, and life feels very kind of like tasky. Got to get this done and that meeting and see that person, and the dogs have to be walked, and my mom's visiting, and sometimes when I'm in that mode, my mind isn't as open to the unexpected. And yet other times I am in that mode, and like I feel like I've sort of got an antenna out, and I'm listening and I'm paying attention and I'm seeing details, and that allows me to start asking questions. And so with the Danish Girl, I was sent a book by a friend who, it was a very academic book about gender identity and theory, and it was a very theoretical book, not exactly my kind of book, but I was reading my way through it, and kind of buried in there, almost in a parentheses, were just a couple sentences about Lily Elbe, and said she'd been the first person to have what we now call gender confirmation surgery. And I And then it went on back to its discussion of gender theory, and I remember thinking, I just put the book down and think, like, wait a minute, if she'd been the first, why don't we know her name? And if she'd done this almost a century ago, imagine how brave she must have been. And how do you do something like that? And when you have no role models, how do you know who you are when no one else is there to show you who you are? I was just really drawn to those questions, and thankfully I was in one of those open modes when I encountered this. My eyes and ears were open, and I absorbed it, and I began to think about it. And so I find if I'm in one of those modes, ideas and stories come, and if I'm not in one of those modes, it's a dry spell.
I had read that when you decided to start pursuing this project, you went to Denmark to research, I guess, and visualize her experience there.
Yeah.
So I'm curious as to if you're writing any project, what is your approach to research, and like what role does travel play in that?
That's a good question. I for me, it's really important. I feel like that I want to kind of get the details. I would imagine for you, even if you're writing a story about the water polo team, and they're when they played Chandler at a away game, like it's the details that kind of create the story, like the specifics of one play, or something that a coach said, or the setting of the pool, or something like that's what I like. I feel like I can ground stories in details, and I think for me as a reader, stories become more alive that way, and I think that's experience of many readers. So when a story is set someplace else, I'd love to go and kind of just see it. And there's something very presumptuous about going to a place that you've never been and writing about it. And you have to sort of approach it with a certain kind of humility. On the other hand, there's something about when you go see something fresh, you take it all in, and you see it in kind of with new eyes. And so when I wrote The Danish Girl, I've now been to Denmark many times and talked to many Danish people about it. And they ask questions like, how do you know all this about Denmark? And it's just because because it was so new to me, I was taking it in, and I could kind of see it in a way that that perhaps people who live there don't see their own country. But also, to sort of be more concrete in the answer, I would look at old photographs, old maps, old travel books, the newspapers from the time, not just to read the stories, but it's interesting to look at the advertisements of what is in the what is being sold, prices, but the stories. So when I was researching her story, I read the newspaper articles about her in Copenhagen in the paper on microfiche, which is this old. Do you guys know what that is? No, that's no. I actually didn't think you would, because it's no longer really used. But newspapers, before they were digitally archived, would be photographed, and they'd be put on. You probably have seen old film, right? They'd be put on old film, and they'd be put into a machine, and you'd turn your way through, and the film would scroll, and you'd look at it. That's how our newspapers were archived until 20 years ago. And so I did that, looking at the Danish newspaper articles about her. There was some coverage of her life at the end of her life. And as interesting, most important were the stories about her, but around her are stories about everything else that might be in a newspaper: politics, culture, women's issues, family life, different things like that. And that helps me kind of understand the cultural context that her life was in. So it's really important to read these accounts of her life at the time, but it's super informative to kind of see what that story is coming out of, and kind of looking at the margins is really helpful And I think that as a writer, I've always kind of looked to the margins for my stories. Like I'm always drawn to the margins, and that probably comes from sort of feeling like that's where I lived as a young person, as a gay person in the 1980s. I felt like I lived on the margins in some regard. In many regards, I didn't, because I was very fortunate to be here at Poly and have this great opportunity, and my family was very supportive of me, and I had a very comfortable life. But because I was gay in one element, I certainly felt a little bit on the margins, and that has always led me to kind of look to the margins for some voices and stories.
And so I read somewhere that your second novel, I think it was, centered around Pasadena.
Yeah.
So could you talk about how your experience living in Pasadena affected your writing career, and specifically that novel?
Yeah. So Pasadena is, I have written books that are historical, set in the past. I like to look to the past as a way of illuminating something about today. And Pasadena is in some ways that. Pasadena is a very historic community, especially for California. And yet, obviously, it is the place you live in today. And so it's interesting to see sort of what about it has been there always, and then what about it has sort of fallen away, and what about its past can tell us about today. And so the setting is something I've always been drawn to. For that book in particular, it came out of a place of where, after I graduated from Poly, I went to college on the East Coast and then moved to New York to work. And I had been away from California for more than a decade, and I was very kind of feeling nostalgic for it and wondering more about where I had come from. And so for that book, I wanted to kind of know more about the history of Pasadena, and that was in part the impulse to write it. But I've used Pasadena, and everything I write, there's like a Pasadena connection. And one of the things, I think one of the common themes is that it's sort of like a home base. It's sort of like the home base for a story, whether or not the whole story takes place there. There's a character whether that's kind of like that's where that character's roots are, and that's certainly my case, where I haven't lived here in many, many years. My parents still live here. They live in the house I grew up in still to this day, and obviously I lived here the first 18 years of my life. But so even though I've gone far away, it's still like home base, and like my roots come back to me.
So I'm wondering, with regards to like the connection between the stories that you're telling, like for example the story of Lily Elbe, which was obviously based on a true story, and the fact that you turn towards fiction in a lot of your work, what do you think about fiction makes it an interesting platform through which to tell real stories?
A couple things. One is with certain kinds of histories, there are holes in the history. There are things missing from the historical record. Certain lives were not deemed important enough to archive, to keep, to record, to write down. And so there are pieces of history that we know the outlines of, but we don't know the heart of. And in the case of Lily, we have a decent amount of information about her, the biographical details of her life, but sort of like that inner life, who she really was and how she felt, and how what it really meant to look out at the world through her eyes. We only have some of that. And this is true of other kinds of characters from the past, other kinds of people from the past, different communities that were not preserved in the same way. Their histories were not preserved, recorded, written down, saved in the same way. And that's why I think history offers this incredible opportunity for fiction writers to go back and look at the holes in history and to fill in with imagination and empathy and research and thinking. And I love to do that. I love books. I love to read books that do that. And so that's the kind of the great opportunity of it. I also think that fiction is a little bit connected to what I just said, is that I love to read fiction that takes me inside a character's heart and mind. I think that's a common element of many of the novels we love, and there's some stories from the past where there's just not enough historical evidence to do that through nonfiction. So fiction allows us to do that. And in the case of Lily Elba, she's a character. In some ways, she's a classic character from fiction because some of the great characters of fiction are characters who have an inner conflict. There's often an inner conflict and then an external struggle, but the internal struggle is the most interesting one and the more nuanced and complicated. And she certainly had that, and her overcoming that is her story. And there's something about fiction that allows you to represent that inner conflict in a very unique and precise way.
So when I write, and I know when other people write, I'm sure for Harper, we usually struggle when we hit like a roadblock or something, and we don't really know how to get around that.
Yeah.
Kind of sit there, take some time off, and think again. Have you faced any significant roadblocks in your writing career? And if so, what have you done to get around that?
Yes. Yes, many. I think, so I wrote a book called The 19th Wife, and before I wrote that book, I wrote almost 75% of another book that I couldn't figure out how to end. And I really kind of hated the only ending I could figure out, and it was based on a historical story, and the ending was very, very unsatisfying, and I didn't really think of all this through, and I struggled for a couple of years with that book, and I wasn't willing to give it up, because I'd put so much time into it, and my agent had read it, and she was supportive of it, but I just knew something was wrong, like at the fundamental sense, and I resisted and I resisted, and I finally put it away. I just put it in a drawer and moved on to The 19th Wife, which I had been thinking about for a while. I'd heard that story, and I knew I was going to write that next, but I kept saying, I'm going to have to finish this first. And by putting that in a drawer, it kind of, I just felt incredibly free to write The 19th Wife, which was a big undertaking, but I felt kind of like, I just felt very kind of free and loose because of that experience. So in some ways, I guess the lesson there is to just listen to your gut about what a story is or isn't. And there's a lot to learn from failing. And it's hard to experience, but there's a lot to, that by writing that manuscript that failed, I learned a lot about like why it failed, what I hadn't done, why I wasn't satisfied with it, and I could take that forward.
My first question was, I read that you had gotten an MBA before you eventually started working as an editor, and you worked in marketing for a while.
Yeah.
How did that impact your writing style, if at all?
Well, I think really what happened was, this is a story of where I felt lost, and I loved writing at Poly, as we've talked about. I loved writing in college, and I had a minor in creative writing, wrote a creative writing thesis, and then after college, I didn't know what to do. There's a real gap between college and telling the world, I'm a professional writer. Like, what are the steps between that, especially of a fiction writer? For a journalist, the next step is a little more obvious. Go to work for a newspaper or a website or broadcast or wherever. But for a creative writer, it was less clear what to do, and so I applied to MFA programs. That seemed like the next step, which is to get a Master of Fine Arts in fiction writing. And I applied to all of the best ones, including Columbia, where I now teach, and was rejected by all of them. And I didn't know what to do. So I kind of did the default, and I went to, I had a job in marketing for a computer company right out of college because I needed a job. I couldn't, my parents have been very generous to me, but they weren't gonna just like fund my fiction career at that point. And so I took this marketing job that meant nothing to me, and then from there, I applied again to MFA programs, and I didn't get into any. And so I also applied to business school and ended up going to business school, and from business school I went to Random House to work. The point of this story isn't so much the MBA, but those rejections from these programs that I thought were my path to the future I wanted were very important to me. I don't think they were wrong. I wasn't ready, and I realized that no one was going to hand me anything in this career. Like, there was going to be no easy path to it, and it really motivated me to say I have to do everything in my ability to make this come true for me, because there's going to be sort of just no one's going to open a door. I'm really going to have to knock on that door very, very hard and then open it myself. And so that experience was really, not easy at the time, but turned out to be really important, and I think really kind of taught me, like, I have to, if you want to make something happen, you make it happen yourself. I mean, obviously a lot of people have helped me along the way, but that idea of, like, that you just determine your own fate.
Lastly, what advice do you have for high school writers?
Read a lot, write a lot. Then I have, like, some sub advice. Read what you love to read, what is important to you, what makes you stay up at night, what makes you want to read it over everything else, because that's what's gonna, like, that's what you should be reading, what you love. I mean, do your homework, but but out of the side of that, so if that's what you should be reading, and then that will lead you to what you should be writing, and not what other people say is cool, or what you think is literary or not literary, or just what's important to you. And then in terms of the other sub advice is, under the writing element, is write what's important to you. I have found that when I write what is important to me, the world will speak back to me and say, somebody in the world, not the whole world obviously, but somebody in the world will say, that's important to me too. And when I write something that's sort of less important to me, I don't get that same kind of response. So, what matters to you is what you should be writing. I don't like to say the word should, but what matters to you is going to matter to somebody else.
Do you have any other questions, Austin?
No. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good luck with